I just want to check if the members online can hear me for introduction, please. I see a number of members online.
Loud and clear, Chair.
Confirmed.
Loud and clear.
Can hear you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If the members online can please introduce themselves.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Good morning to you. Good morning to all the colleagues, members. Khalil Baranka is member of the Budget Committee of Western Cape Parliament.
Good afternoon, Chair. Good afternoon, officials. My name is Kayla Murray, member of the committee.
Okay, thank you so much. Colleagues, with that, I'm handing over to Minister and HOD for introductory remarks, and then we're going to jump straight into the presentation after the delegation introduction. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning still to you and the honourable members of the Budget Committee. We have the full team here to be able to respond to any questions from the Budget Committee. We're presenting two things to you today: the third quarter performance and financial outcomes for the 23-24 financial year, and then, of course, giving the Budget Committee the opportunity to dig in a little deeper to the budget that was tabled in the House. My name is Mireille Wenger, the Provincial Minister responsible for Finance and Economic Opportunities.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, members. My name is Julinda Kantana, Head Official Provincial Treasury. Good morning, Minister. Good morning, Chair and Chairman. My name is Shirley Robinson, Chief Director of Public Policy Services in Provincial Treasury.
Good morning, members. My name is Malcolm Wilson, Fiscal Policy Director.
Good morning, members. Taryn van der Jede, Provincial Government Budget Office.
Good morning, Annelies Spick, Acting DDG for Fiscal and Economic Services.
Good morning, Ms. Cindy Ishmael, Department of the Premier, Chief Director, Strategic Management Information.
Good morning, I'm Paul Pina, Provincial Treasury Director, Business Information and Data Management.
Good morning, Philippus Prinsloo, Economist at Provincial Government Budget Office.
Good morning, Steve Kenyon, Chief Director, Local Government Public Finance.
Good morning, Michelle Nicholas, Director, Provincial Government Finance.
Morning, everybody. Sharon van Breda, Infrastructure Directorate, Infrastructure Manager.
Morning, everyone. Snisi Poikilini, member of the Budget Office.
Morning, everyone. Katlego Khudi, Budget Office.
Morning, everyone. Sean Kirsten, Provincial Government Budget Office.
Morning, everyone. Chad Capon, Provincial Government Budget Office.
Good morning, all. Carmen Murdoch from Provincial Government Budget Office.
Good morning, all. Jonathan Hendricks, Provincial Government Budget Office.
Yes, Member Dagmar?
Thanks, Chair. I'm not sure whether we're just going to hand over to the head of Treasury, but I wondered, given that we have now got a copy of the speech, if it would be in order just to kind of ask a few broad questions to the MEC.
So we will have questions with the questions and answer session. I'm just going to ask that they just conclude the budget presentation for us. It's in the same format that we always do that. And we're going to start with the budget, just because it's legislation, and as usual, we prefer to give the precedence to the legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. We're going to form a little bit of a tag team, so I'm going to kick off and then hand over to the rest of the team to take us through the rest of the presentation. The Minister said it in her opening and in her budget speech that this budget is a budget to keep building a Western Cape that works. Maybe just to reiterate it, given the and we will expand in terms of the conditions and circumstances, prevailing economic circumstances, in which we crafted this particular budget, and maybe also to indicate that from my side to the entire team, those here in the house and also those in the offices still, just also a word of appreciation, Chair, because this was certainly an interesting time. Let me start off by just the first slide, Paul. Are we navigating? Okay, so we're going to, our presentation is going to deal with the 2024 budget process, and that in itself should give the committee just an idea of how we had to approach and change the approach midway in order to respond to the prevailing economic and fiscal context, which we then will look at. We will also look at the budget policy and our service delivery risk, as well as our approach in terms of the 2024 budget, and then ultimately how are we responding to these conditions and circumstances in terms of the budget that has been tabled today, and then some concluding remarks. Chair, I think it is important to reflect in terms of what sets the 2024 MTF budget apart from budgets that we've had in previous years. And the first issue, I just want to know if I should proceed because I see the slides are perhaps not keeping up.
Sorry, Chair, the system is a bit slow.
I think continue, because if the slide is just a bit slow, it will have a bit of a lag, but it will still be recorded, and we do have the documents in front of us as well.
Thank you, Chair. So just to give the committee an indication of the process. So we, from the moment we got wind of what might be coming our way, we had to look at our process. And traditionally, the process has been divided into 3 phases. But what happens within each phase had to be re-looked at in order to respond to the macroeconomic framework and ultimately the microeconomic framework as we had to deal with in our own circumstances. So in phase 1, which is the period between June and September, we focus on navigating the fiscal uncertainty. At the time we heard or we became aware, but we did not necessarily have certainty in terms of the numbers. And so we had to apply a scenario-based and risk-led approach and trying to really gear departments and prepare everyone to deal with whatever might come our way. So we had a scenario focus in terms of our approach during phase 1. In phase 2, which was the period between October and December, also the period in which we tabled the MTBPS as well as the adjustment budget, we really looked at a little bit more certainty. We received our allocations or we received clarity, perhaps just in terms of what's happening in here, and we needed to make certain decisions on how we're approaching the adjustment budget, and then what landed ultimately in the MTBPS. And within all of that, the aim was to achieve in-year fiscal sustainability, and hence the recommendations made by the Provincial Treasury and adopted by Cabinet at that particular point in time. In phase 3, which is the January-March, which is the phase we find ourselves in now, we looked at our response. We received the preliminary allocation letters, and it will then, with certainty, indicated that we needed to respond to a reduced fiscal envelope, and then also within that reduced fiscal envelope, look at then the related pressures over the 2024 MTF. So what this then assisted us really in terms of there's a saying that you must never let a good crisis go to waste, and what this assisted us is really in focusing on, as the heading there is still saying, a more collaborative sharing of information and inclusive approach in terms of how we deal with our budget. So our 2024 budget process in action, which is the next slide, which you will see, aligns the policy planning and budgeting process, and just to give the committee a sense of the processes, a little bit more detail in terms of the processes we then embarked on. So we had our technical engagements that is in year with National Treasury, and we had our provincial visits. We had bilateral engagements with departments, went to Cabinet Postberaad, issued Budget Circular 1, and we also tabled the peril and the merrill, which is then the evidence that we are using to also respond, inform our response to what is happening in this in budget, but also in terms of our response, in terms of the evidence that we gathered and tabled in this house earlier in the financial year. During the second phase, we then had to issue Budget Circular 2. We had our PG MTech 1 process. We then responded in terms of our adjustment budget allocations, as well as provided departments with preliminary 2024 MTF allocations. We then had a head of department workshop, and that was quite useful. And when we get to the budget principles, I think the committee will then have a greater understanding of what then came out of those budget. The head of departments workshops, because it was important that from an earlier age as a provincial treasury, we bring everybody along to ensure that we at least maintain stability and keep communication channels open. We then had our second draft budget submissions that we submitted to National Treasury. We issued our Budget Circular 3, and then we also had our draft annual performance plans. For this last phase, we went into our PG MTech 2 process, had a follow-up workshops with accounting officers, went back to Cabinet Postberaad, then prepared our final draft budget submissions, and today in the House, Minister tabled the OPRE, the EPRE, the OPME, and we are also finalized our APPs. The next deck of slides, or couple of slides, basically deal with Chapter 1 in the OPRE, which is this document, and it deals with the economic context. So everything on the slides that I will be sharing, the information with further detail, the members will be able to find within the pages of the publication, but more specifically in terms of chapter 1. So the first one deals with just the economic environment and the turbulent times that persist. But safe to say, just given the graphs there on that on the slide, it is clear that in terms of our average economic expansion, that has been on the decline consistently over 3 decades. And that in itself is an indication of broader economic challenges, and it underscores the need to stimulate growth. It is important that one can then see also that in terms of both the Western Cape, which is the dark blue bar, as well as then the South African long-term GDP growth trends, which is the red bar, one can see that it follows the trend. So Western Cape largely follows South Africa. But I think the other important point that we want to make here is that consistently the Western Cape growth in terms of GDP has expanded, and the growth is much higher than, or not, well, marginally higher than that of South Africa. So the Western Cape economy is expected to expand by 2.1% in 2024 and 1.7% in 2025. What we have done is also in the graph just below that is to look at, it's the previous one. I'm still on slide 7. In terms of the fourth quarter, where we're talking Western Cape cumulative growth in GDP, it is important to note that our growth surpassed pre-academic employment levels by a full 10.2%. And then with the graph on the right-hand side of the slide, we specifically looking at the repo rate and inflation trends in South Africa, where the blue line represents the repo rate and the red line the inflation rate. And South Africa's latest inflation rate of 5.3% is still within the target range of 3 to 6%. And we are all hopeful for a repo rate cut later on in the year. But in terms of these economic environment that persists, the good news is for the Western Cape that the bulk of our tourism recovery occurred in 2023, when the numbers of foreign overnight visitors at Cape Town International Airport increased by a whopping 53.1% from the previous year. Then the next slide now, which is slide 8, deals with GDP growth. And I also just want to indicate to the committee, when we came to the House with the payroll, one of the things that the members have asked us in terms of how, when we look at the South African economy, is not just to look at advanced economies, but also look at emerging economies and more specifically with economies within Africa. And so this slide provides then a comparison in terms of how South Africa is faring in relation to emerging and developing countries. So South Africa's growth prospects for 2024, which is 1.7%, is significantly lower than what we see in emerging and developing countries, which is 3.9%. And then we looked at what's happening in India, Nigeria, and China. And so the detail is in that slide. So in essence, I think, and we're also trying to illustrate what would be the impetus for growth in these emerging markets. And I think it would then be as we look at what these factors are, it is also clear that those are the areas that we as South Africa would need to focus on if we want to get to similar growth rates over the medium term. Then the next slide, which is the slide 9, just in terms of the Western Cape economic context, some positive trends we're noting, but challenges remain. I think importantly here is that our unemployment rate, if we look at the unemployment rate among race, education, and age cohort in the Western Cape, the first half of that slide deals with the different groupings within the Western Cape. And it is so that our most vulnerable cohorts are Africans, which is 28%, and also then with the correlation in terms of lower than secondary education, which is 27%, and then looking at youth in particular, which is 27.6%. So it is clear. This information is also what we shared with the committee when we came with the payroll. So it is clear in terms of areas that we would need to to focus the attention on and to work on. Just in terms of population growth, we're trying to show that there per district, and one can see there the blue line represents total population growth, and then the red line is dealing with categories of school attendance years between the ages of 5 to 24 years. If we look at the Gini coefficient in the Western Cape, so what we can see is that inequality is persistent, but we do see declining trends, and that we see over the last 5 years in particular, and then in between 2018 and 2022. It decreased marginally in the Western Cape by 0.01 points to 0.59 points. So then the last graph on that slide then speaks to cumulative growth of major crime categories in the Western Cape. And one can see there that murder is still a particular challenge, and something that we need to be addressed in terms of crime where we find ourselves. And then all of these statistics are on the up, and I think the lower line there, the blue line, is showing driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs. That's also on the up. Just the last slide before we go into the budget policy and service delivery risk. We're looking here at the national fiscal context in terms of our debt service costs, which is crowding out our spending on key services in particular. And when the national minister tabled the 2024 budget, it was clear that from a national perspective, the intention is to achieve sustainability by narrowing the budget deficit and to stabilize debt over the medium term. In particular, the drawdown in terms of the gold foreign exchange contingency reserve account, that is the 150 billion over the MTF. That for the first time since 2008 and 9, the national government projects a main budget surplus in 2023-24 if payments to Eskom are excluded from non-interest expenditure. So it is expected, and what we see in the from the National Treasury forecast, that debt is expected to stabilize at 75.3% of GDP in 2025-26, and that debt service costs as a percentage of GDP is expected to peak in the same year. If we just look at that graph at the bottom of slide 10 on the right-hand side, roughly 1.06 billion rand a day is spent on debt service costs in South Africa, and it has crowded out all areas of spending. And so that graph just very nicely illustrates what has happened with debt service costs from what is happening with debt service costs from 2024 up to 2016, 27. Chair, I'm going to hand over to Ms. Taryn van der Rede to take us to the next step. Thank you.
Thank you, HUD. So based on the picture that the HUD just sketched with regards to the economic and fiscal context, naturally so it resulted in a number of budget policy and service delivery risks. And this is for the province globally and nationally. Just to take a step back in terms of slide 12, the 19th edition of the World Economic Forum's Global Economic Risks Report was released, outlining some of the key global risks as well as national risks, and also stating those risks for South Africa. I'm not going to go into the detail of them, but some of the key risks from a global perspective includes AI-generated misinformation. And really the risk related to AI is also the fact that it impacts on the false perception of reality. And at many times also people are then making decisions based on this false information or misinformation. Cybersecurity from a technological perspective is also identified as a risk due to the increased reliance on technology and therefore also impacting on the advancement of technology and the related cybersecurity risk that comes with that. Then with regards to environmental risks, you can see extreme weather events and pollution from a national perspective also resulting in floods and droughts. Societal risks include societal polarization, which largely is related to the extent of inequality, economic trends, as well as many of the political instability issues that we have seen on a global perspective. Geopolitical risks include interstate armed conflict, which you can also see is quite evident globally, and it's also resulting in South Africa having to make certain decisions in terms of positional power and also having to therefore make decisions in terms of which countries essentially aligns to, also resulting in economic implications. Then from an economic perspective is inflation as well as economic downturn, and this has both socioeconomic and fiscal implications more broadly. On the next slide, and also stemming from the economic and fiscal risks as well as the global risks, as part of our overall budget process, we identified a number of service delivery and budget policy risks, and this emanated from our MTech reports and our MTech engagements with the various departments. These cuts across the various areas of growth for jobs, safety, well-being, and ICNG, which is innovation, culture, and governance. With regards to growth for jobs, and I'm just going to touch on a few of them. As a result of the reduced fiscal envelope, we have the impact on SMMEs. So this really speaks to the scope and reach in terms of how many SMMEs we are going to be able to support going forward. The issue around the energy crisis still persists, and therefore load shedding is still impacting on businesses and households. The increase in directing operating costs, as well as input costs for the George Integrated Public Transport Network. An example of this could be around fuel costs. Then with regards to safety, is the funding shortfalls that impact on community safety, and this more broadly impacts on our safety plan. Stakeholder partnership and the quality thereof is also at risk, and these include partnerships such as with the neighborhood watches or community policing forums, and then also challenges with regards to alcohol harms reduction, which could result in an increase in alcohol-related issues. Another safety risk is around support for vulnerable youth, which is now limited as a result of the reduced fiscal envelope. And here again, it's all about the reach and scale with regards to those vulnerable youth that we are able to support. The next slide focuses on the risks related to well-being, and here we have limited youth engagement opportunities. Again, here it's about the number of youth forums that we can support. Mental health is also becoming an increasing challenge, and also for the health forum is the number of mental health facilities that are available in order to really address this increasing challenge. The issue around rising medico-legal litigation, increasing litigation cases, and including medico-legal claims. And then there's also the challenge around the equitable share formula, where the equitable share changes aren't necessarily keeping up with the latest data, and therefore impacting on education and health sectors more broadly. Then with regards to innovation, culture, and governance, there's the risk with regards to the software license costs, and this is largely as a result of the impact of the rand-dollar exchange rate, cybersecurity challenges as a result of the increased reliance and the advancement of technology, and then workplace culture and well-being is also at risk. I'm sure everyone is aware that we are feeling pressure in terms of CRE, and this also impacts on the vacancy rates, impacting on service delivery as well as the staff well-being. Then when shifting over to slide 15, given the fact that we have this ever-changing economic and fiscal environment, we needed to think a bit differently about our overall approach to the 2024 budget. As you're all aware, we previously identified the principles that inform decision-making for the 2023 budget. the HOD also mentioned the fact that we had an HOD workshop. And so our approach to the 2024 budget was really to be a bit more collaborative, be a bit more transparent, and also taking a values-based approach. So given this approach, we then took the 2023 principles, overlaid it with the values that were identified as part of the HOD workshop, and then identified the principles that really underscores the 2024 budget process. So these principles for 2024 includes responding to fiscal consolidation, and here the focus was really on responding to the wage liability, as the fact that we were only partially funded for the wage agreement. Then also having to fit within the tighter fiscal framework was part of our focus on fiscal consolidation. The next principle is around enabling long-run fiscal sustainability. So here it was also about replenishing our reserves, but also looking at what our approach to blended financing and accessing alternative financing would be. Then unlocking allocative efficiency is really about how we make sure that the budget aligns and supports our policy priorities. And then lastly is enhancing productive efficiency. And this is really about focusing on getting that right fit and ratio between compensation of employees, transfers, and infrastructure. Then when further unpacking the principles, we are honing into allocative efficiency, which is really about how we align our budget to the policy priorities. And I will speak about the spending plans in a bit more detail as part of the following slides. But this is just to say that our real emphasis as part of 2024 budget process was to look at what areas we need to prioritize within our priorities of growth for jobs, safety, well-being, innovation, culture, and governance. Then the next slide just unpacks our principle around enhancing productive efficiency. And so here with enhancing productive efficiency, one of our key focus areas is on the compensation of employees strategy that was developed jointly between the Provincial Treasury and the Department of the Premier. And it's really highlighted quite importantly now, given the fact that we have the unfunded wage increases that also needed to be taken into account. Then with regards to transfers, it's really about looking into strengthening our overall oversight responsibilities with regard to transfers, not only to municipalities, but also to our public entities. Then with infrastructure investment and development, it was really about how we put in place a bankable infrastructure pipeline. But a lot of emphasis also now from the provincial treasury side is how we look at accessing alternative funding for infrastructure, including accessing the BFI. Then what underpins these three key areas in terms of productive efficiencies, also our approach to supply chain management, and we're really honing into our e-procurement system and also taking lessons learned and applying them from the PDIA approach. Then with regards to evidence-based decision-making, it's really also how we strengthen our data-driven approach, focusing on data management and also resource capacity building, which includes a lot of work also being done by the Department of the Premier. And then we are continuing our exercise with GTAC with regards to expenditure reviews. This past year, we completed 3 expenditure reviews, which included optimizing COE management, evaluating administration spending, and also analyzing health program expenditures. Then the next section goes into our budget policy response. So given our limited funding envelope, we really needed to make difficult decisions in terms of which policy areas we really hone in on. And then as Minister was saying in her speech, we allocated 45.35 billion rand towards the Growth for Jobs strategy. As part of the Growth for Jobs, one of the key areas is also ease of doing business, which is really looking at how we take a more holistic or systemic approach to red tape reduction. Employability and entrepreneurship, as well as skills development, is also about how we bridge that gap between demand and supply in terms of the labor market. We are continuing our focus on energy resilience and the Western Cape Energy Resilience Program, where we are allocating 759.207 million over the 2024 MTEF to manage the energy crisis. Then there's quite a few other areas, but I'm going to just jump into safety, where the focus really in terms of the safety plan is on 3 pillars of law enforcement, violence prevention, and urban upgrading. And here we're really continuing our focus on the LEAP officers and the 1,200 LEAP officers that have been deployed thus far. We're also looking at the safety partnerships, as I mentioned before, is really focusing on the neighborhood watches and community policing forums. And then also our newly established violence prevention unit that was developed as part of the Department of Health and Wellness. That's really honing in on taking a data-driven approach to dealing with our safety concerns. And then a continuous focus on gender-based violence from our DSD department. Then on the next slide, moving on to slide 21, is looking at the budget policy priorities and spending plans for well-being. Here we are allocating 182.3 billion towards well-being. Some of our key focus areas includes the Rapid School Build program, which is really to address the influx of learners into the province and having an infrastructure approach towards that. The Back on Track program is also dealing with some of the issues around learning losses. The One Health program is also a new program now developed by the Department of Health and Wellness, where they're really honing in on the interconnection between people, animals, plants, and the environment. And then also our continued focus on youth development and after schools, which includes the mod centers and the Year Beyond program. Lastly, in terms of the budget policy priorities, we have 21.87 billion rand allocated to innovation, culture, and governance. And here, really looking at how we strengthen the effectiveness of local governance, supporting the financial sustainability of municipalities. Again, the issue around cybersecurity comes up. And then also looking at how we're starting to strengthen our funding capacity and building capacity around supporting infrastructure investment. And with that said, I'm going to hand over to Ms. Spick for the fiscal response.
Thank you. So the fiscal response or the fiscal framework is essentially in terms of looking at what is the amount of revenue we're receiving as a province, and then looking at in terms of our total expenditure for the province, and then if there is in terms of a shortfall on revenue to cover our expenditure, how do we then finance that shortfall? So this in terms of then there's only numbers on the slide, so I'll orientate ourselves very quickly where the slide is concerned. So firstly, when we're looking at the source, as I indicated, it first indicates in terms of from a revenue perspective, the different sources of revenue. And then it indicates then also the expenditure, the total expenditure that we need to fund then as a province. And then further, it indicates in terms of from reserves, in terms of how much reserves are then also being drawn down upon and how reserves are also being funded. And lastly, in terms of that shortfall or in terms of deficit that we have at the end, how that is financed then essentially. So that then indicates to us the different sources. When we look further then on the left-hand side of the table, it then indicates each of the years of the 2024 MTF. And so each of the years, so if we just look at 24, 25, for example, it indicates in terms of what those allocations or the revenue or the expenditure was in terms of the beginning of this budget process. And then it indicates then now at the end of this budget process what our final allocation is, and therefore the difference between where we started out and now where we're ending. And that it does that for every year of the MTF. Lastly, it then indicates the very last column is in the total differences for each, adding up the differences for each of those financial years. So when we're looking at then in terms of from a revenue perspective, the total net revenue that we're then receiving as a province. So this is in terms of revenue that we did not have before when we started this budget process. The net amount amounts to 2.9 billion rand. And that is in terms of the last column that I'm going to be focusing on. So there's an additional 2.9 billion rand made up of provincial equitable share, and I'll go into detail. The slides following for some of the detail. Conditional grants is also one of the funding sources. We have provincial revenue tax receipts that essentially is in terms of our gambling tax receipts, and you see that is remaining constant over the MTEF. We have not increased our projections for tax receipts. In terms of motor vehicle license fees, there we have increased over the MTF. It's equivalent of about 4.5% increase in 24-25. And you can see that is a net increase of about 299 million rand for the 3 years. On provincial owned receipts, we're increasing that slightly over the MTF and about 45 million rand, and that's mainly in the Department of Health and in terms of increased revenue that they're expecting to receive in terms of nursing colleges. So all in all, there's a net increase of about 2.9 billion rand of our total revenue, and that is seen as in total revenue as A. Looking then at in terms of our total expenditure, our total expenditure then amounts to, and now I'm reading in the middle column, still in the previous slide, 84 billion rand in 24-25, 84.4 in 25-26, and then 86.9 in 2027. When we're looking at in terms of reserves, so that's a 8 billion rand in terms of increase in expenditure over the MTF. When we in terms of look at in terms of what we are then accessing from reserves, that is about 1.3 billion rand, and then that leaves us also then still with a shortfall on our expenditure of 7.1 billion rand. When we look then take the revenue into account, in terms of line A, the 2.9 billion, we then left with in terms of what is called then a budget deficit of 4.1 billion. Here we're accessing then from financing that we are funding from the Provincial Revenue Fund as well as from the Asset Finance Reserve to the value of 4.1 billion rand to balance in terms of our budget. So what this also then indicates in terms of going forward is the fact that in terms of the fiscal futures project that the minister spoke about in her speech is looking at then in terms of the different revenue sources and how we're wanting to influence and in terms of develop approaches to the equitable share, conditional grants, and own receipts in terms of going forward, mainly in terms of to make sure that it has a futures approach, but also in terms of to create in terms of stability that is needed. And in this financial year, and putting the 2024 budget together, it was needed in terms of making sure that our long run expenditure trajectory is able to be financed over the period that we're looking at. I said we'll go into some of the detail, which is the next slide in terms of equitable share. So equitable share is in terms of the majority of our fund to fund our expenditure. 76% of our expenditure is funded from provincial equitable share. And what the slide then indicates to you, especially in red, is in terms of the reductions that has happened over the budget process that started for us in June 2023. And there you can see in terms of the reductions that we have on the equitable share. So that reduction then does create instability and uncertainty if it covers 76% of your expenditure. And so you'll also then see the additions that we have received is in terms of the wage agreement. There's been 2 funding of the wage agreements in this fiscal framework. The last one, about 3.8 billion rand, we received in our allocation letter as late as the 9th of February. So that in essence also then describes, as the HOT has indicated, this budget journey that we've gone on in terms of how we started out with complete uncertainty, and really only on the 99th hour did we get in terms of more certainty in terms of the budget process, which does impact in terms of especially our bigger departments, education, health, and social development. So all in all, when we compare the previous allocation letter in 2023 to the 2024 allocation letter, there's a net increase on equitable share of about 3.7 billion. When we look at conditional grants, conditional grants, this is now conditional grants that we receive from national departments. It's on the next slide, slide 25. The impact of fiscal consolidation at the national level, provinces feel that through conditional grants, or we experience that through conditional grants that we receive, meaning that national departments are funding less to provinces via conditional grants. That's why we see over the MTF, there's a total of 1.1 billion rand reduction on conditional grants. The major, as also indicated in the speech in the Department of Infrastructure, is in human settlements. The human settlements grant reduces by 621 million over the MTF, and the informal settlements upgrading grant by 841 million rand. The education, the schools nutrition grant, there was an increase of 18 million, as well as the infrastructure grant in education for 36 million. Community library services grant, that decreases by 16 million rand over the MTF, while in terms of health, there is in terms of increases in terms of the National Tertiary Services Grant to the value of 150 million rand, Human Resources Training Grant of 20 million increase, District Health Programs Grant that reduced by 180 million, and the Revitalization Grant in Health impacting infrastructure planning that reduced by 70 million rand. On agriculture side, there in terms of a very late reduction by the National Department on the Ilima Letsima grant, that's about 19 million rand, and then the agricultural support grant reduced by about just under 14 million rand. So one of the budget principles, as indicated as part of 2024 framework, is about enabling long-run fiscal sustainability. It is something that we saw in 2024 that was very important and assisted us in order to cushion the fiscal consolidation that was put on provinces. And if we did not have those reserves, some of the services would have been even reduced even further than what it already is presented to you in this budget. So what we have then learned then is the fact that the reserves is something that does save, and it is true that if you save for the rainy day, that actually does in terms of assist you when that rainy day comes. And so one of the principles, therefore, is for us to look at in boosting our reserves going forward, is very important for us as a province. But having said that, what were we able to achieve in this budget that it sees in terms of a decline in real terms is the fact that in our unforeseen and unavoidable, we're still able to put about 600 million on average per year for the MTF. That I need to indicate is only 0.75% of the budget. And then acquisition of property, that is for the lag time to purchase property, mainly for health and education services. Stabilization reserve, we were only able to put a reserve together for the first year of this MTF to the value of 421 million. And then in terms of what is left in from the energy reserve, but really in terms of majority of that is still in a reserve for green hydrogen, is in terms of 50 million rand is left. So over the MTF reserves then is at 2.4 billion rand that we were able to put together. When we then look at the allocations per departments, and that is on the next slide, slide 27. And these allocations now is indicating to you in terms of for each of the financial years. It also then indicates what the final allocation is for each of the departments. And then also what the differences are So in terms of what that allocation was when we started the budget process versus where we're ending off, and the difference between those two numbers then indicates in terms of what that net difference is. It also then indicates, as I said, the expenditure levels was at 8.4 billion rand. If you remember correctly on our fiscal framework, this gives you the detail in terms of where that 8.4 billion rand has gone, and the majority of that, as also indicated in the speech, is in terms of our social services, in terms of education, health and wellness, social development, has seen in terms of the biggest portion in terms of the 8.4 billion rand. So some of the detail then in terms of the next slide, then indicates in terms of what this budget buys us, where it's spent and on whom it's spent. And when we look at in terms of some of the detail, of in terms of where this budget is actually going, in terms of 75%. So 255 billion rand is going to be spent in the next 3 years in this province. Of the 255 billion rand, 75% of that 255 billion, which is 192 billion rand, is really going in terms of to basic services, in terms of for the poor and the vulnerable. And then when you look at in terms of even in terms of what kind of basic services, it's in terms of health, education, social development, and then also there is an infrastructure component, both in health and education, but there's also an infrastructure component within in terms of human settlements, as well as in roads, as well. So then there's also, when we look at in terms of that 91%, 91% of the 192 million, as I said, goes to education at 39%, 41% goes to health, social development is 3.5%, and the Department of Infrastructure is about 10% of our investment. When we're focusing on infrastructure in the next slide, and this infrastructure is indicating in terms of how much our investment is over the 3 years and what kind of investments we're making. So the nature of our investment in terms of infrastructure. And the majority of that is going towards maintenance and repairs, towards refurbishment and renovations and rehabilitation of our assets, and then also the upgrading and the additions of our assets. So infrastructure, for the Western Cape, especially for the 23-24 financial year. So in the current financial year, I think we all can remember the floods that we experienced in June and September, and that has altered and prioritized or reprioritized our project pipeline, for our assets. So we need now, in terms of responding to floods, we now they need to, in terms of look at our category of maintenance and repairs, and obviously refurbishments as well as upgrades. So that's why you see in terms of the response then from an infrastructure perspective. Some give you in some idea of what are top 10 infrastructure projects, and yeah, it's emphasizing again in terms of focus on maintenance and repairs, both within education and then also within infrastructure and the transport portfolios. When we look at the distribution in terms of infrastructure, then on the next slide, and so with the majority of the population in the city of Cape Town, you'll see that most of our infrastructure will be spent there. 36% of our infrastructure will be spent in city of Cape Town, and when we use the percentage in terms of to be spent, then in terms of the next spending at 17.1% is in the Cape Winelands, followed by the Garden Route at 9.5%, the West Coast then at 9.1%, and Overberg and Central Karoo at 6.1 and 1.8%, respectively. And then the majority of the infrastructure spending is then in terms of health, education, and roads, in terms of infrastructure required for services. Then, in terms of further spatial distribution, and now we're focusing on the 24-25 financial year. So, the financial year to come, which is slide 33, the next slide. And then in terms of indicates then in terms of where the province is going to be spending that 84 billion rand for the 24-25 financial year. 66% of our spending will be in the Cape Metro, then followed by the Cape Winelands. That is going to be about 13% of our budget will be spent in the Cape Winelands, followed by the Garden Route at about 9.3%, the West Coast at 5.6%, and then Overberg District at 4%, and the Central Karoo at 6%, in terms of our spending, in terms of spatial distribution. The composition then of our budgets, and this is looking at in terms of comparing to previous financial years in terms of the different economic classifications, and it compares in terms of the 3-year budget that we're tabling today. It compares in terms of the past to what we are planning to spend in the next 3 years. And so, as expected, in terms of a regional government that provides services as in terms of education and health and social development, the majority of our spend will be on compensation of employees. Those are teachers, doctors, nurses, and so on, and social workers as well. And so when we look at COE, that's the dark line that you'll see there, the dark blue. There you'll see that it's the current 24-25, it will be at 54%, increasing to 56% over the MTF, and really the 56% increase that you see that the red arrows are trying to show is, first of all, it's increasing from 24-25, and that is really the carry through of the 2023 wage agreement and the impact that that does have on our composition of spend. But that also means that it's crowding out other spend on other economic classification. And that's also what the arrows are showing in the slide. So what are the other major besides compensation of employees? It's transfer payments that we're making to NGOs in the social development. It's also in terms of transfer payments in terms of education to the different schools for the norms and standards allocations, and then the goods and services also then at 22% spend is in terms of the government purchasing in terms of different services and goods in order to provide the services to the citizens. Lastly, on my side, in terms of from compensation of employees, I indicated that that is our biggest spending item, because in terms of as I indicated, it does represent our teachers and our doctors on slide 35, which is the next slide. That also means that it is in terms of our most important resource in order for the regional government to provide its services. And in terms of where most of that staff actually find themselves in terms of services is in education, and education is about 51% of the headcount, followed by health in terms of 37%, and then also in terms of social services, about 2.6% in terms of social workers. The others also give you a breakdown in terms of where the other compensation of employees indicate. The speech also indicates that in this province, at 54% of our budget, we are in terms of the lowest province spending on compensation of employees. That does mean that for each of the staff members of the Western Cape government, they are seeing more of the citizens than any other province. That is the impact of this table that you are seeing here. Therefore, we're saying that that is one of the critical success factors for us as a Western Cape government, is the staff that we have providing the services. I hand over now to the HOD for concluding remarks.
Thank you. Just in conclusion, Chair, the 2024 budget in a nutshell, to summarize it, tough choices made, hard work still ahead. So the 2024 budget is a budget that ensures long-term economic stability and a future for its citizens through a budget to keep building a Western Cape that works. So 182.3 billion was to support a healthy population with access to medical and mental health care, and that is to properly prepare children for the future with the support and skills they need to succeed and to meet basic needs so that the citizens are cared for along their entire life journey. 45 billion to boost economic growth, to create opportunities and employment for citizens, and then of which there 759.2 million set aside to increase our energy resilience. 32.1 billion over the MTF for infrastructure investment across the priority areas. Infrastructure maintenance and development remains a priority for the province, covering essential sectors such as roads, education facilities, and healthcare. 21.8 billion towards innovation, culture, and governance as a pillar of how the Western Cape government approaches challenges and solves them. And 5 billion to make sure citizens are and feel safe in their communities. So, and Liz spoke to the issue around COE, which amounts to 45.6 billion, and it constitutes 54.3% of our 2024-25 budget, which is the lowest cost in terms of employer ratio in the country. Over the 2024 MTF, COE spending is expected to increase, that is by 3.8%, but that is less than expected inflation, which is at 4.7%. And that we believe is essential for continued budget sustainability. Then the committee to note that we are drawing down in terms of our provincial reserves to support growth, citizen safety, and essential services, and that came the back of the introduction and the need for us to consolidate fiscally. And also in terms of our reduced provincial equitable share and conditional grant transfers. So we do have plans are in place to restore our provincial reserves over the medium term, and this will be done by implementing the budget principles shared with the committee earlier on in the slide deck. And then lastly, Chair, ongoing focus will be placed on managing and mitigating budget policy and service delivery risk through fiscal and non-fiscal measures. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister.
Then just to conclude, Chair, I'm sure you and the Budget Committee members can see that it really has been a very difficult budget process, and we've really relied on those budget principles to help navigate to where we are today. And I'd like to again express my sincere thanks to this full team who really have worked many weekends, did not have a summer holiday, and just responded blow by blow to the ever-changing fiscal framework that we received, and have been able to craft this very professional and sound budget for 24-25. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. I'm now going to take questions. As usual, I'll take 3 per member, and then we'll open up for another round. Any hands? Member Vimbi, Member Nkontlo. I don't see any other hands online, so I'll then go third after that. 3 questions, and we'll do another round after that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Apologies, I just want to note Member Brinka's hand. I didn't see behind the 3 little dots there, but then I'll go in the next round. Thank you. Apologies for the interruption.
I'll have 2 now for now, Chairperson, maybe others. As we go along through the book presentation, I will ask them. Thanks very much, Department and the Minister, for such a comprehensive presentation. It's very helpful. I just want to ask on my usual questions I normally ask on the budget, especially relating to slide 5, the process that was followed. Again, I still think that you might have met all the stakeholders, but again, there seems to be no proper public participation. It looked like it's more kind of a bureaucratic process and a technocratic process rather than really dealing with the public. Because I think there are still quite other stakeholders out there outside those that are kind of briefly mentioned there. I'll make most probably an example. If it's the Department of Health, has there been any interaction maybe with some of the hospital boards, in terms of how their thinking is in terms of because some of these people are dealing with the hospitals. They know what are the challenges there. I can go do the same with the CPFs. I do the same with a whole range of sports entities, because now what we really have is like what the bureaucrats think the community want, not what the community really wants. It becomes more of a top-down approach than being a grassroots-led process. That's always been my problem. Of course, I'm told this is provincial government, it's not local government, but I still think that we can even do a process whereby we can begin to engage these people so that we can, at the end of the day, say we've got what is called people's budget. In that regard, I just want to find out is regarding question 5, because I see they say there are extensive bilateral and function group engagement, collaborative decision making, highlighted by stakeholders engagement through health, DSD, and so on. What are these? Who are these function groups? Is there perhaps maybe you can just enlighten us? Who are they? And then also I see there's been some interaction, obviously, as expected by the cabinet boss Berat. Maybe can we be enlightened as to whether what is some of the issues that were raised the cabinet that eventually ended up finding expression in the budget itself? What were those cabinet issues? Now, of course, the other one is I'm glad at least on page 8, I always raise this comparison. I know in the previous, we've always been comparing ourselves with America and all these established economies, which I think it was a kind of a mismatch comparison. I would have always wanted us to be compared with developing countries because we are regarded as developing countries. There was no use of us being compared with China, America, the US, as well as even sometimes Britain. So at least I see now we've even brought it down even to Africa. And we seem not to be doing well again in terms of our GDP. Maybe is there any intention maybe to just because if you look at India, it really grows, I see even Nigeria, were there any plans maybe to just send our delegation to go and learn how these countries actually grow? We might do a desktop comparison because we're getting it statistically. Maybe there be no practical engagement with them just to see whether what is it that they are actually doing right that we can learn from them as a learning experience. So, but other than that, thanks very much for actually including this. Please give us a good indication as to where we are compared to Africa, rather than just comparing us with the other countries that are not necessarily related to us. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you so much, Member Nkondlo.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and good afternoon. Good afternoon to Minister and her team. And once again, congratulations to Minister and the team to have appointed Ms. Kantana as the HOD. I think that is one of the best moves that must be celebrated. My questions, Chair, are on, I think, slide, called them budget, economic and fiscal context. In slide 7, I think if one reads the bullet points there about the Western Cape economy having surpassed pre-pandemic employment, and the issue of the tourism. My question I want to understand is that, are we able to drill down to this particular growth using data to tell us the extent to which these are direct, the employment numbers particularly, are a direct result of interventions of the province versus indirectly or initiatives of the national economy? And I would like for you to indicate to me what is the source of your data that will then correlate your response. And whether in the tourism recovery we're talking about, are we able also to gauge or gain information that can actually indicate to us what is the level of SMMEs that would have beneficiated from this 53.1% growth in the number of visitors that landed in the province? And I think this becomes important so that when we tell the story at an aggregate level, we can be able to back it up with evidence. The next one is on slide 9 for now. Once again, if you look at the unemployment rate data that is there with the graphs, I'm interested to know if, as this data is here, if you consider the African and the colored population jointly represent almost 50% unemployment in the province. And secondly, you consider the sort of market pool you're looking at with what is in front of us, that in the main you are talking about a high percentage, and nothing much has happened between 2019 and 2023 in terms of education attainment, because you are still talking with a bulk of lower than secondary level if you consider the tertiary achievement. So this is the reality of the labor market of the Western Cape, with populations that we're talking about that are, at these levels. And for me, perhaps this is one thing that one wants to understand. Maybe it will be referred. I'm not sure who is the right person to help us understand this particular data and what informs or what drives, particularly the what's the right English word? The increase, very sharp increase, if you look in the Indian community between 2019 and 2023, from 1.6 to 15%. What drives that? Because if we're going to deal with reality of our country, and when we talk, Minister, about inclusivity and dealing with the poor, because I'm sure nobody wants to sit, and always be defined as the poor. We need to make interventions, and the budget is one tool that is able to do that. So for me, HOD and the Minister, I'm trying to understand what this means, and maybe your G4J, which is what you finance, through this budget, whether it is able to understand what this thing means for the labor market, for the private sector you refer to, that it is the one that is going to create jobs, that this is the reality. Then it asks a question that I normally ask: are we talking about what type of jobs? Decent jobs? Because decent jobs, as per International Labour Organization, are about safety of people, conditions of work, including, their remuneration. And we know low-level skilled people and do not necessarily access decent jobs, because the nature of their profile actually exposes them to those jobs where they are not necessarily broken. And I think we do have such cases in the agri space with farm workers having to yes, being employed, but employed in very poor conditions where even the money that you earn, if we claim that actually when a person has got a job, they've got a chance to participate in the economy. How do you participate in the economy with a job that earns you a wages that's not a living a wage, a wages that earns in all the other things before you can even do something for yourself meaningfully. So I think I'm gonna end there, Chair, so that I don't I think go beyond my 3 questions. I just wanted, I think, in the fiscal context, to just be assisted in understanding what this data means for what we are funding. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Member Brankens.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much to the department also for the presentation. Chair, I just got a very simple question. Is there going to be a high school for the Darling area in the 2024 budget? Thank you very much, Chair.
Okay, Minister and HOD, I'm going to refer to yourselves. You can choose. I'm going to keep my questions for the next round because there's been quite a number of questions already. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Chair and honourable members, for the questions. We'll do our best to them, and I think also tag team here. So, Honourable Mvimbi, your question on public participation. So, as mentioned in the speech, we ran a Messages for Murray campaign again this year, which we asked residents to tell us what they'd like to see in the budget and what was important for them. We had responses from residents in Worcester, from Easterrified, Brooklyn, Khayelitsha, Deep River, Kales River, Retreat, Rosebank, Stanhaven, Langeberg, Ridge, Paarl, Helderberg, Kommetjie, Lanesburg, Maitland, Summer Greens, Milnerton, Goodwood, and George. So we had quite a number of responses from quite a nice geographic spread across the province, which helped to inform us on some of the issues that people wanted to see addressed in the budget. In addition, we do have stakeholder engagement, and the teams can talk to that. But for example, the Children's Commissioner does a review of our budget. So, for example, the MTPPS, there was a full review which we received, and then as a team, we sat down and looked at some of the insights from the Children's Commissioner and how we can be more sensitive in our budgeting towards the needs of children, and are we meeting these demands. So we do have that kind of process. HOT, I don't know if you want to build on that specifically before I move to the next point on the stakeholder engagements.
Thank you, Minister. Also, the Children's Commission quite involved in terms of our analyzing our payroll document and if that is and see whether that is responsive to the needs of children in general and in the Western Cape. In addition to what ministers indicated, through our engagement with local government, I think the part that we did not show here is the engagements that we have with formal local government, and although it's not directly public participation but through local government, there is a measure of participation because we engage local government in terms of the priorities, in terms of their budgets, in terms of the response, and how do we then respond, and also to see whether our proposals in terms of the responsive to what is coming from local government as identified in the need, as a need. So we also do that, and that we run through the various fora, but most importantly, Minister also chairs the MACO members of finance in terms of the budget and governance forum, and that is also a forum where we engage with local government in that particular manner through the cabinet Bosberaad. I think Minister will touch on that, or must I just continue? Okay. Yeah.
Right. So then the next question was around, what was the Cabinet Bosberaad's kind of input into the budget process? So if you go to slide 16, you'll see then our budget principles, which remain constant, but you'll see it's overlaid with the values, and in the cabinet Borsbarat, we then combined those as an outcome of the cabinet Borsbarat, and then you'll see the principles for 2024 then overlay those two things here. So you can see the shift from 23 to 24. Given the fiscal environment, we had much more of a whole of government approach going into the budget. And here we had to respond to fiscal consolidation, the wage liability, fitting into a tighter fiscal framework, which were then layered the 2023 principles. And Cabinet Borsbarat, which includes the heads of department, was something we really did workshop quite a lot to make sure that we were all on the same page. We could understand what the risks were. We took in a risk approach to make sure that at the end of the day, the budget does actually address the major risks across the system. I don't know if I dealt with that. Okay, then going back to slide 8, thank you for the suggestion to include some of the emerging market economies in our analysis, which we've now done. Not in this portfolio, but with my other hat on in Growth for Jobs strategy, we have done an analysis with peer countries. And in each of those 7 priority focus areas, we have a look at how does South Africa stack up in comparison to those other peer nations in respect of export development, in terms of skills development, etc. And it shows where we're doing okay and where we're not. And just to give you an example, for example, we'll look at what is South Africa's GDP spend in relation to research and development in comparison to Mexico or Nigeria, etc. And there you'll see that we actually are very far behind our peer countries. And research and development is critical for being able to increase the complexity of the economy and ultimately to enable job creation. And that's just one small insight that is in the Growth for Job strategy. So I would encourage to actually go and look deep into the chapters. You'll see some of those comparisons. We have some nice graphs which will show in each of those areas how we compare in terms of what we're doing to grow the economy. Then was that all Honourable Bimbi's questions, or did I need do you want to add? Okay, So we've done the research. I suppose that's the answer to the question, is that we have done the research in the Growth for Jobs strategy to try and understand what are some of those constraints and why we're not growing at the same levels as our peer countries. Then if we move on to Honourable Nkondlo's questions. So there's quite a lot that needs to unpack on the specific graph, so I might hand over to the teams there. But just to stay on the tourism side, I'll take that question. We are actually modeling what the growth in tourism, especially over the past summer season, which has smashed all previous records. What does that mean specifically for job creation and ultimately how that will support SMMEs? That work should be done by the end of the month. So we'll be able to share that with the honourable members then, because we're really trying to understand that role that it plays in the economy. But there are specific provincial projects that definitely contribute to, for example, not only the recovery, but now the growing tourism sector in the Western Cape in particular. And one of those is the Air Access program. I mean, that actively goes and seeks direct international flights into our region. And over the last 10 years has really been, for quite a small spend comparatively, a very big success in drawing tourists to our region. For the first time ever, over the summer season, we will have breached 1 million inbound seats into Cape Town. So it shows that project in particular is something that is successful and has brought in the tourists. And with tourism, of course, comes more job creation and injection into the GDP. So I thought, let me just highlight that one in particular. But maybe the teams can go into the specifics of all the graphs on slide 9. And then we'll go into the Q4 QLFS numbers.
Thank you, Minister. I believe there was a specific question also in terms of what's happening in terms of our numbers with Indian. So we will also touch on that. But maybe just before the team goes into the detail, when we look at that slide that that has got the unemployment stats there. If we look at the if we then compare to what the education levels, then one would really look at then what are we doing within that space as a first attempt to upskill the and to have access then to education when it comes to the citizens that we are serving. And so if we then look at how that budget would respond to that through you, Chair, Member Nkondlo, the provincial budget, the bulk of that budget is spent on education, and 74% of that is spent on public ordinary schools. And the importance of continuing to stabilize that and ensuring that as many as possible and that most actually children access the education system and exit the education system at and at a higher level will increase the opportunities, or the opportunities at least improve the opportunities to find employment. And so from a provincial perspective, in terms of our basic services, that is also how the budget is responding in terms of that. But the detail I think the team can provide, just unpacking and also the source for our data. Thanks, Shirley.
Thank you, Chair Minister. Member Mkondlo, we come to this question every year because of the sources of the data on the labour market. The particular graph that is drawn from the PERO is drawn from quarterly labour force survey statistics by South African Stats SA. And that is a sample survey. And so by the time we come to a Western Cape cohort, the sample is much smaller. The Development Policy Research Unit Labour Market team at SALDRU at UCT has done quite a lot of work on this. And so the sample size of the Indian population is in working is very, very small. So hence, yes, you are right. There are problems statistically in that. We don't have another large survey from Stats SA in this regard. So there's really exciting work that is being done on administrative data. And the spatial tax data that has been released by National Treasury. Next week, there's a workshop led by Human Science Research Council and the National Treasury that starts to look at other sources of administrative data that we could mine. And an interesting aspect is whether we can start drawing on UIF and other administrative data sources that start really testing and aligning into the special tax data. That said, this is a source that we have at this point, and we draw the QLFS data through Quantec, as I understand. Okay, and so Quantec is our data provider in this regard. It does mean that we are constantly looking for innovations as we drive the special tax data and see what other forms of administrative data we can utilize, particularly as in this province, we have a really robust health and education administrative data source that we haven't utilized and mined in this respect. So we are starting to engage with our colleagues in that regard. I'd also like to draw attention to the work that has been done by the Harvard Growth Lab, Houseman, on the inclusive growth. And it takes that binding constraints, and we'd like to try and bring that down to the Western Cape, understanding what are provincial levers that the provincial budget can respond to. And as the HOT and the Minister have noted, our responses are very much in the social services and working with our municipal colleagues on basic service response, with a number of the economic levers really still at national level. And so as we start looking at the lifting those binding constraints. It's about how we can decouple from the national growth to breakout growth through also looking at how we decouple from a national from energy, and as we move into renewable energy, and how we deal with the other constraints. We're hoping to take that kind of understanding into a far more in-depth analysis in the PERO in the coming years, and also to look through other innovative data sources that really take us out of this particular logjam on the question that you asked this morning. Thank you.
High School for Darling, page 127 on the overview of the provincial and municipal infrastructure investment. The High School for Darling is in the project pipeline to be spent. The plan is at this stage 46.5 million for 24-25, and then another 46.5 million for 25-26.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm taking the next round of questions. And just in case we have other questions like the High School of Darling, should you do need to know the respective infrastructure and in which phase of the infrastructure it is and how much money for that particular financial year is paid for, you will find it in your infrastructure book, as I like to call it. You usually also find it under the respective budget vote of the respective, like education, health, in the big estimates book, just in case there are members looking for their respective constituencies' information. Do you have more questions, Member Mimbi? Please ask your questions because then I can ask mine afterwards.
One or two questions that will really be my last question for this term, for my term. Yes. No, thank you very much, Chairperson, and thank you very much to the Minister and the HOD for the responses. They might not be satisfactory, but it's some improvement compared to some of the answers I've been getting in the past. So slowly but sure, and I'm very patient. So I'll wait. Hopefully at the end, it might get to what we really want. Because sometimes, just to be practical about an example, the constituency I'm serving, it's a place called Oudtshoorn. Now, I know there are municipal roads and there are provincial roads. There are some of the roads that I know is provincial roads, and their conditions they are. If maybe we will have allowed the residents in the area to say, look, what are your priorities you'd like the provincial government to look at? They will certainly say, look, it's that road. But of course, we are doing it kind of at a bureaucratic level. We might not be aware of those things. That was just one example, but I'm sure we'll get there. Now, one other question, Minister, I think you've raised is I think even in your speech, you've mentioned something to the effect that South Africa will spend an outstanding 1.06 billion a day on servicing its debt. Now, as truthful as that may be, I would like to check whether, if we compare ourselves with other countries of similar nature at an international level, normally what is the norm there? Because that's why we have comparative economics and comparative economy. If we compare ourselves to other countries of either similar size or similar markets as well, what is normally the norm in terms of servicing their debts there? Now, that will be my one question, and I think that's all. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And just a suggestion, take it or leave it. When the messages for Marais came out, I'm constituency head for Laingsburg. I have some WhatsApp groups that I'm on, and I sent it. And one of the youth that I assisted previously with something sent me a long list of things for messages from Murray. And I was like, no, you must go on the link. don't message me. You must go on the link. You must send it to Murray. So I don't know if that is the same youth that sent Murray the things from Langsburg. I'm hoping so. I do also know that particular youth had a lot of higher education questions and not necessarily particular provincial matters. So my suggestion would also be when these particular things come out, that we also just distribute it to our respective WhatsApp groups in the respective communities. Okay. My first question relates to slide 10. This is also related to a bill that has been introduced that will affect the full budget of the country, including the budgets of the provinces. And it's essentially relating to the gold foreign exchange contingency reserve account, which South Africa is going to be drawing down 150 billion rand from. So in my mind, you know, when you're in a household and you have problems in the household and you need to start selling off stuff, you usually start with trying to think, okay, can we sell clothes? Can I make lemonade? Do I get an extra job? Do I sell the car? Do I sell the furniture? Where can I save? Where can I cut debt? Where can I consolidate? You don't usually go straight to the house. And when I look at the type of entities that we are bailing out and how frequently we are bailing them out in the country every single year, and when I look at, for example, Eskom's bailouts being almost 10 times more than the province's budget, which was totaled last year, then I start thinking to myself, instead of drawing down from our gold and from our reserves, why can we not just deal with some of the entities and say, actually, perhaps you are not the best option for South Africa as a public entity. Perhaps we need to consider a different option for you. It feels like we're going to the end of selling the house before considering other options. But if I could just get some information on how provincial treasury's view is on that, perhaps it is the best decision, and I just don't have all of the information. The next question I have is regarding the public wages on slide 24. Now, I'm aware of the fact that our PES is going to increase less than inflation and our conditional grants are cut. From what I can calculate on slide 23 as well, we're drawing down on our provincial reserves by about 4.2 billion rand over the next MTEF, over this MTEF. So what I'm trying to understand is how much do we still need for public wages? I know buffers have been put in from national. How much do we still need? Is it still the 1.1? Is it more? Is it less? What has been paid back? Does anything else need to be paid back, essentially? Because if we still need money, that's going to have to come from somewhere. Then on slide 26, regarding the stabilization fund, I know in the November presentation last year on the 28th, we used up our stabilization fund. I see that we are putting more money back into the stabilization fund on slide 26 at approximately 420 million. And our energy reserve is also a little bit less, but I'm assuming that's also because there's a new MTEF. But if I could just understand where this money is being drawn down from, is it just a little bit from every budget, or you took it from a particular program, or how did you come to put money back into the stabilization reserve? And previously, my understanding was that we needed the money for the public wages. What is the reason that we are keeping this particular stabilization reserve fund there in terms of purpose? Thank you. Yeah. So those are my three: gold, public wages, stabilization fund.
Mbembe's question. Okay, should we start then with Honorable Mbembe's question? I think you've answered.
Thank you. Much, honourable member, for your question. So I think there's two aspects. So South Africa's debt to GDP ratio is about 16 percentage points higher than the average emerging economy. But at the same time, for the first time in a long time, 25 developing economies have spent over 20% of their revenue on debt servicing costs. So it is something that is emerging economies around the world are experiencing, but we are still higher in terms of our debt to GDP ratio. I hope that answers your question.
Then on your question on the gold and foreign exchange contingency reserve versus bailout to SOEs, I mean, so these are all budget choices and trade-offs that have to be made, right? And I think in the national space, one has to look at, well, what are those choices? Are we going to cut things, or are we going to take from elsewhere to continue funding? And these are all the kind of deliberations that were made in the national budget process. And I think that's probably why there was a decision to tap into the contingency reserve. Most of it, I understand, is to defray some of the debt servicing costs to bring it down over the medium term. But the particular trade-offs there are clear in how that national budget is and has been put together. And if anybody wants to add on, do you want to add, Shirley? Go ahead.
Sure, Minister. HOT Chair. So the particular fiscal context, as Chad has alluded, is we're at the same point where we were when GEAR was announced over 20 years ago. In that our debt to GDP is rising on a trajectory of nearing 80%. And that would then create a fiscal cliff, at which point other emerging economies end up in an IMF rescue package. So GEAR was put into place at a similar point in 97, 98. And I checked those papers that I had on my computer from all those years ago, and the interest payments were 21% of the budget. What are the interest payments as a share of the consolidated? They're 21% now. So in order to create a debt trajectory that does not put us into a sovereign default, JEFRECRO was considered as a once-off. And it's important to note, we are in election season, that it's quite critical that it's a once-off. The National Treasury team worked very closely with IMF and other international consultants to ensure that the settlement mechanism on JEFRECRO with the Treasury is very, very carefully structured to minimize the costs. And that was also linked to the introduction of a fiscal anchor. So I think that province sits members at the end of this particular decision. And it is most certainly as a result of constant bailouts, etc. But that said, it is important to get on top of the fiscal position. It would be interesting for chair and members to review Michael Sachs of the Public Economy Project. Michael Sachs's review of the budget notes that we should monitor this carefully going forward because it excludes the ESCOM payments, which are still below the line. So if you had to look at it above the line, we are most likely to be in a similar consolidation budget next year. It's not that we are suddenly got a get out of jail free card, which means that South Africa really has to right size in its public service. Right size in terms of using what we have more productively. And so hence the budget principles in the Western Cape budget that the Minister tabled, as well as looking at alternative financing sources. And so we are in lockstep with the National Treasury in this regard. But this is certainly a conversation. Those levers, however, are not at the provincial level. That said, it does bode that there is a significant intergovernmental advocacy conversation that the Western Cape leads in this respect. Thank you, Minister.
Then there was a question on the drawing of reserves and the what's outstanding in terms of the wage deal, and then the stabilization reserve. Where did those funds come from, and why are we putting it into reserve? HOT, do you want to?
Thank you, Minister. Maybe just before I think Annalise is going to come in here, I think the relevance and the need for reserve was well demonstrated as we try to respond not only to our disasters, but also to COVID, also to fiscal consolidation. And so the need to continue with building these reserves, because I think Minister indicated in Minister's speech, used the term pay as you go budgeting, one day budgeting, sorry, pay as you go budgeting. But in essence, what we need is greater certainty and stability over time, and with us keeping the reserves, or at least replenishing the reserves is a measure, trying to get us to greater fiscal sustainability over time. So Annalise will go into the detail in terms of where that funding came from. But your other question, just in terms of the public wages, I think also there's a slide, the very same slide provides the allocations in terms of the wage, the top up, or in terms of the carry through. So what we still have a challenge with is India in terms of the 2023-24 budget, but and that is the amount that we have been communicating in terms of the 1.1 billion. But I think it is important that we also keep in mind that the 1.1 billion and the effects of that over time is in real terms might be more than just the 1.1, because if whatever we need to reprioritize away from in order to make up the difference, that cost with inflation keeps on rising, and so it in reality it's costing us a little bit more, but we have a 1.1 billion in year shortfall. Annalise?
Thank you, Chair. So to add on to what the HOD is saying, so if we look at in terms of the cost of that 1.1 billion rand, in terms of where do we find that funding, majority of it in terms of was infrastructure. So we built less schools this year than we were planning to in the beginning of the financial year. And therefore then if we must continue our infrastructure plans, obviously in the future, that cost of building that school is so much more. And I think that is what the HOD is referring to. So regarding the stabilization fund and the origin of the funding, where did it come from? So in our province, and what we are extremely proud of is in terms of our cash management policy that we have in the province, and how we manage and fund the various departments regarding their cash. It is not as in other provinces, where perhaps in terms of a department gets funding in terms of for a month, for example, for the expenditure. We actually fund every day. So we have a team sitting in the provincial treasury that is almost kind of bankers of the province and of the departments. And what they actually do is in terms of they only fund departments what the departments need for that day or for 2 days maximum. Then what they do is they sweep then the accounts, the bank accounts of departments that the departments are not using, and we go and invest that money. And so that's why we were able to earn interest from our cash management policy. So for the current financial year, we are looking at earning about 1.1 billion rand from that practice. And therefore, we were able to access 702 million for the fiscal consolidation response in November. So obviously, what is left over of the 1.1 billion is the 421 million from interest earned. And that's why we then also, because of the nature also of that kind of funding, we then also then putting that in as the stabilization reserve from that perspective. But that's the origin of the funding, Chair.
Member Mvimbi, any other questions? As you've heard, we're selling off the gold to pay for debt so the bank doesn't come for our house. We made lots of interest and now we have extra in our stabilization fund. And we still want our money back. More or less the summary. Okay. Are there any follow-up questions or new questions before we head to the next presentation? If not, let's jump straight in. And Minister, I'm not sure if you need it for the next presentation, but if you wish to say, you're more than welcome. Because it's the general financial and non-financial performance. Just for those members who aren't necessarily permanent members who might want to log off, I'm going to check, are the members from the public want to ask questions? None. Going once, going twice. I don't know if their mic's upstairs.
No, they want to come down.
Okay. Okay, no one wants to come down to join us. Okay. We will then, I then ask members that the respective legislation will then go to your respective budget votes. So, for example, your education component will go to education, your health component will go to health. The committees will then deal with the respective vote. They will have a report on the vote. It will come back to budget, and then budget will vote on the respective legislation. But the appropriations bill is so tabled. Thank you. And just before we move on to the financial and non-financial performance of the third quarter, I just want to remind members it is of the quarter previously. So we've today received the budget as at today on the 7th of March, but we're also reviewing the spending of the previous 3 months before we got to the budget. So there might be information that you now already know. Okay. Then, yes, the rest of the feedback I can give at the end of the meeting. Thank you.
We have the presentation. So while we're putting the presentation up, just in terms of, as the chair's indicated, just the context then of the third quarter. So this is, we're indicating in terms of the performance, really in terms of the APP performance, and then also the financial performance of departments and public entities as at the end of December. So also the context of that end of December is, we just need to remember, we just passed in terms of in November, we passed an adjustments budget, also indicating in that adjustments budget and the current financial year that we find ourselves in is also in terms of extreme uncertainty up until November. And then when we got news in terms of the adjustments budget, in terms of just some forward looking, but in terms of the context then of the current financial year is the fact that we did not receive full funding for the wage agreement, as we just discussed. And secondly, we also, department saw a reduction on conditional grants in the adjustments budget. And therefore, in terms of as it for the first 6 months of this financial year, that uncertainty of not knowing where we're going to get funding from the COE has impact in terms of the performance and financial performance for the first 3 quarters of the financial year. And so it's in that context that we're also then presenting both in terms of from an APP performance and then also from the financial performance. As per usual, then I hand over to my colleague from the Department of Premier, Ms. Ishmael. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to start off. Previous slide. Yeah, okay, thank you. I'm going to start off with a socioeconomic picture through the lens of our provincial strategic implementation plan and the outcome indicators that it measures. As the House would know, that we're not only focusing on the performance indicators as measured through our quarterly performance system, we also keep our eyes close to the socioeconomic index. Following from the discussion from the budget, where employment is a critical positioning within the growth for job strategy, the provincial strategic implementation plan. We keep on tracking the GDP and also employment and the category of jobs. So as we have learned earlier, but for the quarter three in particular, the GDP for Western Cape declined by 0.36% during that particular quarter of reporting. The number of people unemployed it decreased by 0.7%. But I just want to add there that as we stand now at quarter four, the narrow unemployment rate stands at 20.3%, although we're not actually showing it during that period of reporting. And then just another key point is unemployment and unemployment, that it decreased by 3.1% in quarter three, and that was a reduction from 715,000 to 693,000. And then for the quarter four now, it increased by 1.4%, from 693,000 to 702. I felt it's necessary just to give that context, because at the time of reporting now, we're already in quarter four. Then through the lens of safety, there's an increase in violent crimes if one look at homicides in the Western Cape, and that 8% year on year from the same quarter in the previous financial year. Very importantly, 30 metro priority areas recorded 7.9% increase in homicides and 4% increase in the number of sexual assaults presentations at public hospitals compared to last year. We want to look at well-being through the lens of the outcomes and the socioeconomic environment. The HIV positive rate for 15 to 24 years in particular for the first quarter was 1.4%, and 16.5% of our children born in government facilities weighed under 2,500 grams. And that is our proxy indicator also that we are using also for in terms of the children and the weight. And now we're moving on to the core of service delivery. And in relation to the budget, in relation to what we, our quarterly performance targets that we have set into our annual performance plan. So overall, for the particular quarter three, we achieved 86%, which is about 439 of 413 targets achieved. Our performance trends overall for 2023. Overall, for quarter one, it was 74%, and for quarter two, it was 77%. So a nice increase to 86%. But looked at of departments, then one see 372 of 429 targets achieve 87%. None of the 13 departments achieve 100%. But that is also due to quite a huge number of targets, even though it's 9%, but 40 targets are partially achieved. So not achieved is 17 targets or 4%. We want to look at our clusters. They want to see the government clusters. Overall performance 92%, social cluster 89%, and economic cluster slightly under with 79%. Then we want to look at our public entities in relation to the particular votes. achieve 67 of 84 targets is 80%, and 5 of those 10 public entities achieve 100% of their targets. Partially achieve 12 targets, which is 14%, and not achieve 5 targets, 6%. Again, when we look at this through the lens of our clusters, then one see the government cluster, 82%, social cluster, 78%, and then the economic cluster, 80%. Interestingly, slightly different to the overall departmental picture in terms of cluster performance. So very briefly, this graph just depicts what I've actually just narrated. But suffice to say, yeah, that just 9 departments achieved more than or equal to the Western Cape average of 87%. And then 4 departments achieved less than the average, 87%. Thank you. Next slide. Very briefly again, 7 public entities achieved more than or equal to the 80%, and then 3 public entities achieved less than the average 80%. When one come to this time of the financial year, where we kind of almost close off the financial year, and one look back and one actually reflect on what is our progressive improvement, then one can actually see how each department over the 3 quarters have actually incrementally increased achieving of the targets. I highlight in particular Department of Health and Wellness. One can see that in the first quarter achieved 58%, second quarter 61%, and the third quarter 89% of the targets. It shows how a particular department seriously went to go look into what's your planning, your budget alignment, or what are those targets that we're not achieving, and how do we review these targets? And then there are also departments with very consistent achievement or consistency in their progress. And that is our Department of Provincial Treasury, where you can see 97% first quarter, second quarter 93%, and then back to 98% for quarter 3. And then our Department of Premier, we have scored consistently 94%. Quarter 1, quarter 2, with a slight decrease in quarter 3 of 89%. And what is the story then for our public entities? One could see, if I just highlight Wesgro in particular, the quarter 1, 60%, a very nice sharp increase then 80 in quarter 2 and quarter 3. One must also look at, in particular in the public entities, that the number of targets to be achieved is definitely not as many targets as in a particular department. That ends off my review of the quarter 3. Thank you.
When we're moving along then now on the financial side of things for us as a province, as at end of December, we spent 73.5% of our budget. As I indicated, that this is still in terms of end of December is really still in terms of the first month really of a bit more certainty for departments. And so you'll see in terms of departments that's slightly lower than the average spend, is in terms of, for example, in terms of the provincial treasury. There's also then in terms of Department of Local Government. And then we're looking at the departments of economic just make sure. I'm sorry, now that's the Department of Mobility and then also the Department of Infrastructure. And as I indicated, these are number one, there's a combination of provinces, departments that, in terms of make transfers to municipalities, especially. And that actually happens in terms of post and end of a quarter. And that is really in terms of to make sure that the agreements that has been reached in terms of performance, either in terms of targets that needed to be reached for the end of the quarter, that is first verified by the various departments before transfers then take place. That not only in municipal level, but that is throughout transfer payments within our province. So you'll see then in terms of just some information in terms of where we find ourselves at the end of January. There has been improvement in terms of those votes, in terms of where provincial treasury now stands at 76%. Department of Local Government has improved to 60%. And then also Cultural Affairs and Sport has increased to 73%, Mobility 75%, and infrastructure now is sitting in terms of about 67%. So there has been, in terms of improvement, as I indicated, that we're coming out of that time of uncertainty post the adjustments budget. So overall, and we were also showing an over expenditure by the Department of Health in terms of 94 million rand. And so this is also a reflection not only on our Department of Health, but I think I've mentioned it before. The health sector is finding itself in really in terms of fiscal sustainability, in terms of going forward, where their baselines are not increasing to the higher than inflation on the expenditure that is required. And so when we look at just in terms of just the story around health in the 94 million rand over expenditure that they were indicating at the end of December, this is really in terms of addressing the backlog in theatre lists, the increase in the patient numbers, as well as I indicated, the higher than inflation on the goods and services is the impact that they were feeling. Now, what would also then happen is the fact that within health, and our health department has a very good track record of making sure that they come within budget at the end of the financial year. So previous practice would have been that they would have slowed down, for example, the compensation of employees in terms of rollout. Now, when we did not receive a full funding of the wage agreement, and they only received 70% of what they needed for the wage agreement, it meant then that that kind of slowing down did not have the impact that it usually has in terms of when they slow down, they will have a saving, because they actually had to reprioritize in order to make up the wage agreement, because they only received 70%. So you can then see them in terms of the practices that assisted them to deal with their goods and service pressures they cannot do in the current financial year. And so that's one of the reasons then why they're pointing out the 94 million rand over expenditure that they're currently facing. So that does mean that each of the different business units and institutions need to go back and in terms of looking for even further savings, but that does impact service delivery decisions within institutions for the health sector. And unfortunately, that does carry through over the MTF as well, because as indicated in the budget speech, we have about a 3% increase in our revenue. However, health is showing in terms of medical inflation rate is CPI plus 2. And so that is in terms of the impact that the entire health sector as a country is facing, not only us as a Western Cape. So when we look at in terms of the compensation of employees and how we've been able to manage that, so there's been a net movement, a positive 1,266 more in terms of staff members in the Western Cape government. Mostly in terms of education at 124 posts that consists of educators, about 950 of them as educators. And then within educators, there's also temporary teachers. So it doesn't mean that they have employed full-time 949 teachers. Some of them are temporary teachers in terms of that will fill in, for example, in terms of teachers who go on maternity leave, teachers who in terms of, for example, are on sick leave and so on. So that's in terms of where majority of the employment has gone. And health and wellness, and there's 117 million rand net increase in terms of appointment of nursing staff, and that is just in terms of the backlog as indicated in the previous slide. And then the mobility, in terms of that, the increase you see in the headcount for mobility is a combination of increase in terms of traffic officers, and then also the shifting of funding. So you'll see there's a concomitant reduction in the infrastructure side. It's still the shifting in terms of the funding, the headcount in terms of from staff that was previously in terms of transport and public works, and therefore an infrastructure establishment being moved over to mobility, because 23-24 is the first year of the establishment of both those two departments. Next slide then looks at public entities, and at this stage for public entities, they've spent 68% of their budget, with about a 1.5 net over. Underspending that has been indicated. And then when we look at in terms of just some of the detail, the 1.1 million rand overspending that you see on Casidra, that is impact on COE. And that the Department of Agriculture will then, in terms of their transfer payment that they make in the fourth quarter, will assist in Casidra where that is concerned. Moving on to the infrastructure spend as at the end of December, again, uncertainty has an impact, very big impact on infrastructure performance. And so, as I indicated also earlier, in terms of the planning that we had for 23-24, as soon as we heard that we were not going to get funding for the wage agreement, it impacted in terms of infrastructure plans in the current financial year. And then the second one, in terms of our infrastructure plans, is in terms of the impact of the flood damage, requiring a reprioritization of the entire project list, especially in our departments that looks after roads, for example, and then also Cape Nature, because in terms of their funding is also in terms of looking at the roads in terms of on our various reserves. So when we look at the spending there, it's about 61% of our spend, and that will improve in terms of the fourth quarter. And we are monitoring that with the various departments in terms of where we think we're going to come out in terms of infrastructure spend at the end of this financial year. Within the human settlements, you do see that there is, in terms of spending, there is about 46.8, and there is really in terms of the impact in terms of land invasions, and then also in terms of community protests that has impacted in terms of the rollout of the various and the performance of the various projects. When we look at own revenue in terms of our collection of own revenue, there at this stage, there's no risk of under collection at this stage. Overall, on provincial own receipts, we're looking at, in terms of collection, of about 758 million rand. On our tax receipts, as in terms of motor vehicle license fees, there's an increase there, and that's the growth in our motor vehicle population. And then on our gambling taxes, there's an overcollection projected about 166 million rand for the current financial year. As I said, we don't see a risk at this stage for us in terms of under collection on our revenue. As per, just to end off, Chair, as per always, we do have some of those detailed delivery trends per department attached to the presentation, really in terms of for the members to assist the members in terms of the various portfolios when they are have the departments in front of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Members, questions? Mbemvimbi?
Question, Chairperson, just a point of clarity. Maybe with some explanation, it will assist me to understand it. Page 3, it says some positive signs, the heading there. Then it says increase in violent crime, homicide in the Western Cape increased by. So I don't know, maybe that was just the what do you call the topic itself does not talk to. I don't think that will be a positive sign. I think it might have just been a typo or something.
I also think it's a typo because there's different colors for the positives, but Ms. Ishmael?
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you. You were very observant. We see some, it was not all a positive signs. Yeah, yeah. So there are some positive signs,
yeah,
like
so
the
if-
decrease in green and the yellow, it's moving towards a positive sign. Thank you.
Ms. Ishmael's covered me. I wanted to just explain to the people at home how they interpret the different colors on the thingy as well. Okay. Any questions, Bimbi? Anyone online? It's just us, the last standing. But I think, and we still are a quorum. I see the members that are online. I think also it's because a lot of the information was already covered by the budget that was tabled today, and sometimes that is the case with budgets and adjustment budgets. Before you go, I just want to say thank you. None of the members online or sitting here in front of you know whether they're going to come back after May. There might still be opportunities that we see you before then, but this is the last budget that is being tabled for our term. Last time I'm going to be explaining things like equitable shares and conditional grants and selling off the gold in my own normal, non-financial English. And I just want to say thank you. We've walked this years. So 5 years, it's 5 years. I just want to say thank you for the hard work. And Ms. Quintana, I know I did message you when I found out and everything, but just congratulations again. This department works very, very hard. I mustn't tell the other departments that you're one of my favorites. And just to Miss Ishmael as well from the Premier's department, the amount of work that you've put into developing and evolving the reporting mechanisms with your team over the years has truly been astonishing. Every single time we come back to budget committee, there's a new evolution in the reporting of the data and how we monitor particular things and how we tighten up the alignment between what is happening and what we are paying. And I can also say that despite us having sat here, my English is now running out for the day. Despite sitting here for the past few years, every single time I learn something new. Today, I learned that we invest our interest and that we can put our money back into a reserve fund because of those type of prudent decisions that we make. That not only are we trying to make sure that we stretching every single cent as far as possible, we're saying, okay, how can we use our money to work for us? And I just want to say thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I know your other colleagues went back to their day-to-day activities, but when you get back to the office, please tell them we really appreciate the amount of work that you put in order to be able to serve the province. Thanks.
No, thank you, Chair. And maybe if I'm allowed, also from the Provincial Treasury side, in particular, to the committee and the Secretariat, you help us sharpen our tools. So with every question that you ask, with every challenge that you put in front of us, we really go back and we actually reflect. We said, okay, next time when we come back, these are the issues raised. So we need to address them. And for that, I think I just need to also express our heartfelt thanks and gratitude in terms of the work that you're doing and really pushing us to improve. And so some of the questions asked, we already know what we need to work on moving forward. But like as our when we started with the first presentation, we're acknowledging where we are, and we're also acknowledging that there's still work to be done. But really, thank you to each and every member and to the chair and the secretariat. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the PT and Premier officials that are in the house and online. You're welcome to go about your day-to-day business. If you wish to join us with our committee business, that's also fine. We never say no, thank you. But just for the committee members, if you can just please remain online. I just have some feedback. And I think we have one set of draft minutes. Okay. We can maybe just put the draft minutes up.
Thank you, Paul. You're right, sure. You're right. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. Sorry, we're just sharing some good academic news with one another. Um, okay, I just want to make sure who's here with us. Okay, myself, Member Mvimbi, and Member Murray were in that meeting, so I think we should be fine. Okay, let's start with page 1. Okay, page 2. Oh, that's it. Members, are we in support of the minutes? Member Mvimbi proposes that we adopt. Member Murray?
Seconded.
Thank you so much. With that, the minutes are adopted. Members, my feedback that I have for you is feedback, but it's also not really feedback. So we have not yet gotten the dates from National for the consideration of the Division of Revenue Bill. Usually by now we have received it, and usually you would have seen it plotted out on our program. At the current program, the last one that I saw at least in the NA, they will be considering the fiscal framework on the 13th of March. And they'll be considering the DORA on the 27th, if I remember correctly, of March. Because the Division of Revenue is a Section 76 bill, it must still go to the NCOP after that. Based on my own timeline calculations, based on the Money Bills Amendment and Related Matters Act of 2009, if the fiscal framework is adopted on the 13th, then the national budget, in terms of the division of revenue specifically, will need to be concluded either the 2nd or the 3rd of May. I think it's the 2nd because the NA fiscal framework is on the 13th. That means that if we are going to get DORA, I'm going to just kindly ask budget members to please be on standby. You may see amended programs coming into your diaries, and there is no next programming committee. And I just ask that you are patient with us in this regard, because the division of revenue affects all the national money that is sent to provinces. So it is a very, very important bill, and how we feel about that bill in terms of our consideration of the bill is therefore very important. As you may know, the bulk of provincial money comes from division of revenue legislation. So how we feel about that legislation and what it contains is of critical importance. So I'm just going to ask members to just please be on standby. For now, I think that is the only feedback I have. I'm not sure if there was something I missed.
Just we'll meet on the 25th.
Thank you. The next meeting that we will have is on the 25th. Is that our last meeting? And other than being on standby for DORA, that will essentially be our last budget committee meeting for the term. With that, members, I wish you all the best this afternoon, and all the permanent and alternate members of this committee will be sitting in other committees throughout the coming week. I wish you all of the best in your budget deliberations. Please, a reminder to send your respective reports to the budget committee so that we are able to consider the full bill, but our procedural officer will remind you of that. With that, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.